Welcome back to the second hour of News and Views on Salam Media. This is where we also welcome our Polokwane listeners to the station. And that, of course, is our listeners on One Nation FM. To hope you'll keep me company for the rest of this hour. We're now going to be talking with Dawie Roodt. He's a renowned economist and he has put out a very strong message this new year suggesting that South Africans have absolutely no reason to leave South Africa, but those staying should make the right choices to protect their wealth. Now, for me, Dawie, a very good morning to you. Welcome to the show. Lovely to be talking with you once again in the new year. What jumps out at me is you making a very bold statement in an election year. Is there any significance to that?
Good morning to you. Wonderful to talking to you, and a wonderful year for you.
Thank you.
Um, and no, I've been saying this all along, and that is that South Africa is a well. Let me start from the beginning. We were fortunate to visit some family overseas, and I can tell you it's beautiful to go to other places in the world, but it is extremely expensive. Now, a country like, for example, New Zealand, that we visited over the festive season, is a country that is beautiful. It is clean. It is safe. All sort of things happening there. But I think if you put a roof over New Zealand, you will have the biggest old age home in the world. No, so what I'm saying, there's not much
Okay,
exciting happening there.
let me come in there. Why
Yeah.
is that? Why is New Zealand, which is a relatively young country with such an rapidly aging population, what's the reason for that?
No, it's not the age that I'm referring to. It's everything is so calm. Everything works so well.
Oh,
Uh,
okay, okay. I
everything
misunderstood.
yeah, that's actually what I mean by that. Of course age also plays a role, but that's not what I mean. And I've been to Europe, for example, the same sort of thing. South Africa is an exciting place to be. Of course there are many bad things in South Africa. We've got massive levels of crime, unemployment, and poverty. The place is dirty, all sort of bad things happening in South Africa, but at the same time we have South Africa was the most amazing weather. When I got off the plane coming back from New Zealand, the first thing I noticed is that the sky is so blue in South Africa. It is just so blue. In New Zealand, you hardly ever see, well, you see the sky every now and again, but the sky is not blue. South Africa is really a very special place. One of the first things that I did when I came back is to buy a proper steak for a third of the price that I would have paid in New Zealand, and to have a proper braai in South Africa. And to come home, I just feel at home in South Africa. So South Africa is a special, special place with all its with warts and all. But as an economist, I think what is important to understand is that the world of the economy is changing. The world that we conduct business is changing. And the world today is pretty much a village. And it is so much easier for anybody to do business everywhere in the world. So if you are a South African and you've got the necessary skills, then you can do business all over the world. It doesn't matter, and you don't have to go there. You can be in South Africa, and you can still be part of the global economy, provided you have a proper internet connection and the necessary skills and so on. And of course, very importantly, you have to manage the risks in South Africa, and there are many risks. So if you can manage the risks, like for example, crime and safety, and many of the other issues that we have in South Africa, I mean, what an amazing place to be. South Africa is the place to be, but you must be able to manage those risks, and you must be able to participate in this new world economy that is pretty much, well, service orientated and digitizable, if there's such a word, to be part of the modern economy. And of course, there are one or two other things that you need to do. Purely from an investment point of view, you have to make sure that the big chunk of your assets are invested abroad. I advise people to do that. I assist people to do that all the time. Make sure that you have the right structures in place. But stay here. What an amazing place. But stay safe. That is perhaps the single biggest challenge.
So, Dolph, some people might argue that yes, it is very expensive to live abroad, but if you've been transferred or if you had enough money to relocate abroad and you start earning in dollars or euros or pounds, obviously everything then becomes relative, does it not?
Well, of
because
course, yeah,
you're earning in the currency of the said country you're living in, and you're going to be using that as your barter or trading tool.
correct.
So then it's pretty relative, is
Of
it
course.
not?
No, 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 without a doubt. So I speak to family members that live abroad. They've got the living standard that I have. If you convert it via current exchange rates, then they, in rand terms, they earn a lot of money. But in dollar
But
terms, or whatever the case may be, they earn much less than. So in relative terms, it is pretty much the same kind of thing. So if you work abroad and if you earn abroad and you have to your expenses abroad, then that's not necessarily expensive to be abroad. For South Africans, it is very expensive. There's an interesting thing that I've picked up there, and because I think I'm comparing myself to family members that's, I would guess, more or less in the same position as myself. And I'm comparing myself to them, and I realize although the living standards are roughly the same in South Africa or some other places in the world, for me to go to New Zealand is extremely expensive, and vice versa for them coming to South Africa. And the reason why that is so is because our currency, the rand, is completely out of line in terms of its valuation. So the rand is hugely undervalued. So, relatively speaking, I've got the same living standard as my family abroad. But once I convert my income into dollars, for example, then suddenly it becomes very expensive to me. So, steak is much cheaper in South Africa than in New Zealand. But for New Zealanders, it's not expensive. For me, it is, and vice versa. So the question I'm trying to answer: why is it that our currency is so extremely undervalued? And I think the answer, and I try to put numbers to this, being an economist, I try to express things in numbers. And I think that approximately 50% of the undervaluation of the currency must be ascribed to things like, for example, a lack of confidence in South Africa, the price that we're paying because of the government that we have in South Africa, perceptions towards South Africa. So we're paying a huge premium because of what people think of South Africa. And that's why it's so expensive for South Africans once you want to go abroad. But you're absolutely right, it is a relative thing. But the exchange rate of the currency, to a large extent, mirrors the sentiment towards a country. And at the moment, what I can read from the exchange rate is that sentiments towards South Africa is really, really rock bottom at the moment. And we can see that in all sort of indices. You can see that in business confidence index and the consumer confidence index and all those sort of things, is that sentiment to South Africa at the moment is quite low, and I would say rightfully so, if you look at the quality of South Africa's government and many other things and so on. But again, there are many positives to South Africa as well, and I did mention the weather and the price and many other things as well.
Okay, let's look at the issue around. You indicated that you could still live in South Africa, enjoy a wonderful lifestyle here, keep safe, obviously. You also mentioned that the majority of your portfolio should be invested abroad. What about buying investing in property in South Africa? Is that a good idea? And I'm
Yeah,
also then going to talk about the Western Cape, and you're
yeah,
probably going to say to me supply and demand.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it seems as if the growth, the property price, the growth in property prices has escalated beyond all imagination in the Western Cape, and it has stagnated in Gauteng and KZN.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Let's
Is it supply and demand?
Yeah, oh, yeah, of course. But let's just fundamentally understand property. So let's just see what property. Let's look at the benefits, the pros and the cons of property. Now there are many positives for property. One very important positive for property is that usually, not always, but usually property tend to increase. Property prices tend to increase with the rate of inflation at least. So if you want to hedge against inflation, property is not a bad investment. Another good thing is that to invest in property, and this is a very important benefit of property, you can gear property, which means you can borrow against property. So you can use somebody else's money, the bank's money, to buy property as an example, and you can maintain its value in terms of inflation. And that certainly is a benefit of property as well. A third benefit of property, and that's a little bit subjective, is that you need a place to stay. So why not buy the place that you're staying in? And maybe even if you want to buy a holiday home and you can afford it, that's also not necessarily a bad thing, because the family gets together there and they take beautiful pictures and they enjoy being together. That in itself is worth something. So those are the positive of property. What are the negatives of property? And there are quite a lot of negatives on property. One is that the transaction cost of property is very high. Buying and selling property is much more expensive than buying and selling, for example, equities on the JSE, as an example. Another thing about property as an investment is that the geyser tends to break. So there's maintenance cost involved, and also that's a headache. Another issue about property, the collection fees for rent, for example, getting your rent from your tenants is not always that easy. And sometimes you've got issues about that. There's an issue about a property as far as that is concerned. So put all of this together. Perhaps buy your own property if you can get a good price for that. Make sure you borrow against that. Make sure you can the sums add up. But from an investment point of view, I would rather go for something else. I would rather go for something more liquid. If you want property, buy listed property, as an example. Transactions cost is going to be much lower. You don't have to be concerned about the geyser, as an example. But as always, there's always a bargain lying around. And if you really can pick up a good bargain, go for it, of course. But
Sorry.
generally speaking, I am not a big fan of property. You
Can
mentioned,
I ask you? Can I ask you? What do you mean by listed property? What is that?
no, listed property there are many listed companies on the JSE. It's big companies
Ah,
that, yeah, they own property. That is their main business. And if you like property, then you can buy a share in a company that owns property, as an example. That's what I mean by
okay.
that. But
What? Yeah, and your ideas on gold and gold shares, is
I,
that
I,
a
I'm not
good
a,
investment?
I'm not a fan of gold again.
Okay.
There are some times where you can invest in gold. One very good example when you invest in gold is if the dollar gold price suddenly starts increasing, or put differently, if we have talk about very high American inflation. I specifically mention American inflation because the gold is denominated mostly, or it's priced mostly in dollars. So if there's huge, or you expect high inflation in the United States, then chances are that the dollar price of gold will go up, and that's a reason to buy gold, as an example. Then we're talking about high inflation, really high inflation, and we don't have that at the moment. Another reason to buy gold is that you want to flee. You want to take your gold, put it in your pocket, and jump on a plane and leave the country. And that's a source of you can save your valuable. You can save in gold. And you can flee, for example. Is it necessary to flee South Africa with a pocket full of gold at the moment? I don't think so. I don't. Another reason why I want to go. What I don't like about gold does not. If you buy a bar of gold, or you buy a Kruger Rand, for example, in a year's time, it will only still be one Kruger Rand. It could be worth more, but it's not going to be two Kruger Rands. So gold does not multiply in a way that you get dividends from share investments, as an example. So generally speaking, no, I do not like gold as investment, because it does not give you a return. It does give you a capital protection, perhaps, not always, but perhaps, but it does not give you a return. If you want to buy gold and you're really keen on buying gold as an investment, except for circumstances like what I've just described, then I would rather suggest buy gold shares. Because if you buy gold shares, then at least you get a dividend, and you are also get the benefit of a rising gold price, as an example. And of course, there could be sentimental reasons why you want to have gold. I mean, you
Okay,
inherited some,
so gold shares is the way to go.
yeah, if you
Let's
want
look at
gold.
this. Let's look at this trend now. There's a huge push amongst young people to semigrate to the Western Cape. But at the opening of the interview, I indicated the shocking rising prices of property in the Western Cape. What's going on there?
Wow, that's easy to answer. I think there are, well, two things. Most importantly, what is happening in the Western Cape is that the Western Cape government is just much better than the government on a provincial level and on a local authority level than most of the other provinces in South Africa. Most of the ANC-run provinces are mismanaged. Most of the local authorities managed by the ANC is mismanaged compared to, and it's of course, it doesn't mean that the DA is always doing a good job, but compared to the ANC, the DA is doing a dramatically better job than the ANC. And I think that is a primary reason why people are leaving Gauteng. Gauteng level of crime in Gauteng, and again, not always, but generally speaking, crime is much higher in Gauteng. We've got potholes, we've got corruption, we've got incompetence of government, and people see that and they're voting with their feet and they're going to the Western Cape as an example. I think, and that's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen after the election, because there's quite a good possibility that the ANC will lose provinces like, for example, Gauteng and even KZN. Who knows? With a bit of luck, we won't have an ANC government in Gauteng anymore, and it will be interesting to see if, say, for example, another political party can pull off the same what the DA did in the Western Cape and make Gauteng a more attractive province. And maybe that will sort of reverse or at least slow down the current semigration that we are seeing. It's going to take a long time to fix things again in the provinces that was damaged by the ANC, but perhaps it can be done going forward. But I would say the simple reason is simply because the Western Cape is better managed than most of the other provinces in South Africa. And I can just mention that I am not necessarily a great fan of the DA.
Okay. Point taken. What is the reason for property prices stagnating in Gauteng? I mean, Johannesburg, for example, supposed to be the city of gold. We refer to the Sandton precinct as the richest golden mile on the continent of Africa. But despite that, it seems as if property prices, even in the upmarket areas of Greater Johannesburg, has either stagnated or has even fallen.
I think it's incorrect to talk about property prices, because when you talk about property prices, there are many different kinds of property. For example, there's some technological changes taking place as well. People working from home, for example, is one good example. And because of that, people do not go into office blocks anymore, or not that much anymore. And typically, you will find where there are many office buildings, like, for example, in Sandton, is that some of these office blocks are less attractive and prices are falling because people are simply, and it's not because it is in Sandton, it's simply because there's a change in the way that people are working. So technological changes is having an impact. Also, what is happening is some of these shopping centers, we keep on building new ones, but some of these shopping centers are simply running dry or running empty, because other ones are taking their business away from them, and also because the nature of shopping is changing. People not necessarily going to retail shops anymore, not that much. They make use of Amazon or Takealot or whatever the case might be. So there are some other changes apart from the fact that it is in Gauteng. Then if you look at certain other prices in certain kinds of property, you're absolutely right. When you talk about residential property prices in South Africa, it is in Gauteng, it is falling in many instances. But there are examples where residential property prices are actually going up in some of the security complexes and very attractive areas that people like to go to. In some instances, you actually get an increase in property prices in some of these cases. And also talk about the Western Cape. It doesn't mean that all property prices are going up in the Western Cape. In some instances, property prices are also going down. And as always, when you talk about property, especially residential property, people will tell you it is about location, location, location. And there are also some locations that are not very attractive in the Western Cape. But generally speaking, you're right. And the reason is simply because people are moving to the Western Cape for business, but also because of some personal reasons, because of crime and the like.
We do know that the elections are around the corner. How do you think that's going to impact on property prices all around the country, and just lifestyle and living standards? I know you're going to say that it's going to depend on, who wins the elections, coalitions, etc., etc., etc. But your sense of how this is going to unfold?
Yeah, I think, and I'm planning to write some articles about this. I think what is probably going to happen, you're going to see more of the same, which is bad, and that means more of an ANC-dominated government. It is some good news. It is that the ANC could lose control over Gauteng, for example. Let's hope so. It is possible some other provinces, like, for example, KZN, and maybe even some of the Northern Cape, not necessarily lose it, but the ANC is going to lose some support there. But on national level, I think the ANC is going to still be the dominant party. And if the ANC lose big time, like say get less than 40%, then there is a possibility of a coalition with some other political parties that I'm not a great fan of, like, for example, the EFF, and that can lead to even more disruption to the economy. Up to the elections, I don't think we're going to see much activity. The economy elections in itself can be disruptive. There's uncertainty about the elections and politics. And until then, I think the private sector is simply going to sit on their hands and not take major decisions because they want to see what is going to happen to the elections. So until the elections, not much happening. Thereafter, it really depends on who's going to be the main guys in terms of politics in the country.
But as an economist, you are still suggesting and advising people to stay put in South Africa. It's still a beautiful country
It's
and you can lead a great lifestyle. A couple of months ago, you and I had a conversation when Russia invaded the Ukraine. I think you are married to a Ukrainian. Am I correct? Do I have my facts
to,
correct here?
to a Russian
To a
lady.
Russian. There you go. Not too far wrong. And you were in that part of the world during that time, and you guys just managed to get out of the country in the nick of time. How much has that situation impacted on global pricing, oil prices, food prices? You indicated, and as we all know, we've now become a global village. At the time when I spoke to you, I think both you and I were hoping that this would then fizzle out in a short space
Yeah.
of time and things will go back to normal. I'm not even going to talk about Israel and Gaza now. I'll leave that for another conversation with you because we are running out of time. But that situation is ongoing, is it not?
Yes.
How is it impacting the global markets?
Yeah, yeah. Well, initially it was quite disruptive to the world economy. It still is quite disruptive, that specific conflict. But some markets have stabilized. A good example is the energy market has stabilized to a large extent. Energy prices, oil price example, has come down quite a lot. And I think the world is gradually, and that's the reality of the world. That's the reality of financial markets. There's a new crisis. It is disruptive initially, and then gradually the financial markets adjust to that, and that is what we're currently seeing. I think the conflict in the Ukraine is going to go on for a long time still. It can escalate into something much worse, but for now, I've got the feel that it's pretty much a stalemate, and that nobody's really making any progress, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Russia. I do know the Russians put a lot of measures in place to try to support their economy. And we do know that for example, the rest of the world has put all sort of measures in place to try to pressurize Russia. So it's a bit of a tit for tat here and there. But at the moment, I think and all wars are always bad, but they seem to be a little bit more a kind of a stalemate currently happening in Ukraine. It is not at the moment having huge impact on financial markets or on commodity markets, like for example the energy price or even food prices. So, and I think that this conflict and perhaps the stalemate is probably going to go on for quite some time. But I must add, I think a change in politics, especially in the United States, may also affect the current conflict in Ukraine, and it may, uh, in a weird kind of way, actually uh, push it in a certain direction and maybe lead to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. But let's see what's going to happen to politics, because politics can change things quite drastically and quite quickly.
Dawie Roodt, always a pleasure talking with you. We will have a conversation again sometime soon regarding the conflict well, it's not a conflict, the genocide in Gaza and how that is shaping world politics, and obviously regarding pricing of food, grain, oil,
Yes.
etc., and how we see this playing out going forward. Let's leave that for sometime next week or the week after. Always a pleasure talking to you. Go well and keep safe.
Thank you very much. I'd love to talk to you about that as well. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. 9:35 news and views on Salam Media. Stay with us. We still have two interviews lined up for you. We will be talking with Imran Mukaddam. He is a community activist and CEO of Inspire Media Networks. We're going to be looking at the shenanigans of Shahid Davids and the Umrah scandal. But right now, standing by to talk to us is an amazing young man. He is Tariq Jenkins, not new to the show. We've spoken with him in the past regarding saving our sacred lands. This time around, he is going to talk to us about penning a beautiful poem dedicated to our legal team that have just arrived back home in South Africa. And let's talk about how he was inspired to do this poem. And he's going to read the poem to us right here on air in a minute or two.